As I placed the first edition leather-bound copy of that old Hemingway back onto the shelf, its worn spine released a faint crack that whispered through the archive room of the New York Public Library, a sound that felt almost judgmental in the stillness. My fingers lingered on the cover longer than necessary, a habit shaped over years of seeking comfort in stories that belong to other people, in lives far more vivid than my own. The scent of aging paper and preservation chemicals clung stubbornly to my ash-gray sweater, a scent I had learned to associate with safety, with invisibility. I sat alone in the suffocating quiet of the third-floor archives, where the dim glow of flickering fluorescent lights could never warm a room that rarely saw anyone but me. My name is Clara Hastings, 28 years old, a rare manuscript librarian. And in this enormous city, almost no one knows I exist. Some days I am not sure myself whether I am truly living or simply drifting through a muted version of the world. Silence has been my most faithful companion since that night 4 years ago, the night I was nearly robbed and almost lost my life on the platform of the 7 train. If he had not appeared, I would not be here. I never learned his name. All I saw was a tall figure breaking from the shadows, the sickening sound of his fist connecting with the man who had thrown me to the ground. He lifted me up, asked if I was hurt, then vanished into the crowd like a ghost in a leather jacket. The police came later, but I remembered nothing except his eyes, cold and molten like heated steel, terrifying yet inexplicably electrifying. After that night, I was no longer myself. I began searching for him. At first, it was nothing more than scattered online searches, then hours wandering through public buildings, cafes, busy streets, and train stations, hoping to catch sight of those shoulders, that gaze. And then I found him. Nathaniel Russo, 37 years old. A well-known businessman, owner of the luxurious Veritas nightclub chain. In the newspapers, he was mysterious, elegant, successful. In the underworld, he was a man no one should ever cross. I do not know how I recognized him with such certainty, only that something inside me refused doubt. I began following him from afar, from a place that felt safe. Every Thursday, I sat in the cafe across from Veritas and wrote in a small red notebook everything I observed. The way he stepped out of the black car, the way he never arrived with the same companion twice, the way he checked his phone exactly once before walking through the door. These insignificant details became my private world, a world I did not need to enter, only observe. I wrote it all down, never missing a thing. Not because I was strange or broken, but because it was the only way I felt real. On those pages, I was no longer a forgettable librarian, I was part of his orbit. No one knew. Not even Lauren, my only friend from college. She always told me to go out more, to meet new people, to live like a normal woman. But I was not normal. And I could not stop thinking about him. I thought of him every time the library doors closed behind me, every time I sorted books by call number, every time I turned the final page of a tragic novel. I thought of him like an unanswered question, a persistent memory, a wound that refused to close. And I knew that no matter how the world shifted outside, I would always return to that same seat across from Veritas, waiting for him to appear, just to see him once more. Because in that perfect silence, I felt alive. If you have stayed with me this far and feel something stirring inside you, please take a moment to subscribe to our channel, to like and share this video so we can continue bringing heartfelt stories every day. And if it is not too much to ask, could you tell me where you are watching from? Leave a comment below and let us know which corner of the world this story has reached. We treasure every word you share. That night, 4 years ago, was a bitterly cold December evening. the rain pricking my thin coat like needles as I descended the steps into the Midtown 7 train station after a long evening shift at the main library, exhausted and aching from the noise of a protest that had echoed outside all afternoon. The station was nearly empty, only a few shadowy figures bowing their heads under the pale neon glow. I moved toward the long bench, pulling out my phone to check the time when hurried footsteps behind me froze me in place. A man, hair unkempt, brown coat frayed at the shoulders, eyes darting wildly, stood less than 3 steps away. Before I could react, he lunged, one hand gripping the strap of my purse while the other yanked hard enough to send me staggering backward. Everything happened too fast. No shouts, no help, no witnesses rushing forward. I remember the screech of his shoes sliding across the tile as I struggled, panic rising like fire in my chest, my throat locked, unable to scream. And then, in the bleakness of that moment, a figure emerged from the far end of the platform. He did not shout, did not warn, did not hesitate. He moved with a speed I still cannot comprehend, grabbed the attacker by the collar, and delivered a punch so decisive, so cold, it felt as though violence was second nature to him. The man collapsed, rolling across the platform, still clinging to my bag. My rescuer pulled it free with a single sharp motion, handed it back to me, then glanced down at the groaning man. The look in his eyes. I had never seen anything like it. Not anger, not fear, something darker and sharper. The look of someone who had lived with violence and now treated it as a small task to be tidied away. He looked at me, his dark eyes catching the harsh station light, and asked in a low, gravelly voice, "Are you all right?" I nodded, unable to speak, my heart racing not only from terror, but from the strange, shattering intensity of his gaze. He turned and walked away before I could thank him, disappearing up the stairs into the night as if he had never existed. The police arrived 5 minutes later. Bystanders gathered, and a station agent pulled me aside with questions. I lied and said I could not remember the man who helped me, that everything happened too quickly. But in truth, his face had etched itself into my memory like an inked mark that would never fade. I did not sleep that night. I scoured the internet for any mention of an incident on the Midtown subway platform. Nothing. No talk of a mysterious rescuer, no footage captured. I wondered if I had imagined him. But weeks later, I saw him on television in a business report. Nathaniel Russo, owner of Veritas, young entrepreneur, the man behind a rising entertainment empire in New York. He wore a black suit, a gray tie, eyes that never smiled, sharp jawline, and a gaze unmistakable. I nearly dropped my glass when I realized he was the one who had saved me. From that moment, I was consumed not with a foolish romance, but with the sense of being pulled into the orbit of something vast, distant, dangerous, and impossible to resist. At first, I told myself I only wanted answers, that understanding him would explain why his gaze had shaken me. But the more I learned, the less I could let go. I followed every article, every paparazzi photo, every rare interview. Slowly, he became woven into the fabric of my inner world, a figure I dared not approach, yet could not stop writing about. And so the little red notebook began on that day, its first line penned in trembling but steady script. He does not know my name, but I am grateful, and I will not forget. I never imagined that only a few years later he would be the one to open it, read every word, and look at me as though I were the most unfathomable thing he had ever encountered. I do not believe Lauren intentionally chose that place for her birthday night. I know she loves elegant spots with dim lighting, strange cocktails, and electronic jazz drifting through the air like the ghost of cigarette smoke. But out of all the nightclubs in New York, her choosing Veritas felt like fate playing a cruel joke. I held the invitation in my hand, my fingertip tracing the edge of the cardstock as if it could offer me an answer more nuanced than yes or no. A part of me, the rational part I had starved for 4 long years, screamed to refuse. But the other part, the one that had spent countless hours quietly recording every movement of a man I never dared speak to, thrummed with a restless, undeniable eagerness. Lauren knew I would decline instantly if she mentioned Veritas up front, so she waited until the last possible moment to reveal it. During her rushed Wednesday afternoon call, her voice bubbled with the confidence of someone who had already arranged everything and left me no room to escape. Clara, listen, this year has to be different. We need to do something special. You deserve a night where you actually live a little. You need to dress up, wear heels, and drink something without reading the ingredient label first. We're going to Veritas. You know that place, right? I had been silent for so long that she had to ask again. Are you still there? I nodded automatically and whispered a tiny yes that barely rose above breath. I could not lie. Of course I knew Veritas. I knew the place so well that I had cataloged every stage light behind the bar, every security camera, every menu redesign through the seasons. But I had never stepped inside. So many nights I sat across the street watching people line up, laugh, disappear behind the glossy black door marked with a silver triangle. And now I was preparing to enter that world. No longer the observer. That entire evening, I did nothing but search for a dress. Lauren kept texting, insisting I wear the red one she had bought me last fall. I had never worn it. It was too bright, too fitted, too much like someone I did not believe I could ever become. But I put it on anyway. I stood before the mirror and stared at my own reflection with uneasy disbelief, as if the woman looking back was someone else entirely. Someone a man like Nate Russo might glance at for a single fleeting moment. Before leaving, I hesitated by my desk. There lay the small red notebook, the keeper of my secrets for 4 years. Logic screamed at me to lock it away, to leave the evidence behind. But tonight felt like a farewell, a funeral for my obsession. I needed it with me, not to write, but to hold onto like a talisman against the fear threatening to swallow me. I told myself I would write one final entry at the very place I had watched from afar. Goodbye, Nathaniel. And then I would be free. I shoved the notebook into my clutch. It was a tight fit, straining the clasp, but having its weight against my hip made me feel grounded. I left home later than I should have, took the train toward Tribeca, then walked several blocks. The closer I came, the harder my heart hammered. I saw the lights of Veritas before I saw the door itself. People in line dressed as if attending a movie premiere. And there was Lauren, waving in her shimmering deep blue sequin dress, glowing like an urban angel under the city's night sky. Clara, oh my God, you actually wore that dress? You look incredible. I forced a smile, though my lips trembled. I did not tell her that I was not there for her birthday. Not for friendship, obligation, or pressure. I was there for a reason that, if spoken aloud, would have shamed me too deeply to lift my head again. I was there for him, for the fragile chance that tonight he might be here, that I might see him not through glass or streetlights or the distortions of memory, but in flesh and bone, in the same room. And if fortune dared to show mercy, he might see me too. Not as a stranger hiding in the shadows, but as someone who existed in his world for one fleeting breath. Music throbbed softly against my ribs the moment I stepped through the glossy black doors of Veritas, not loud but pulsing with the rhythm of some living creature waiting to swallow me whole. The mingled scents of expensive perfume, red wine, and warm golden light created an atmosphere both mesmerizing and suspicious. I tightened my grip on my clutch, feeling my palms begin to sweat. Lauren plunged into the crowd with the ease of someone who belonged there. She turned, laughing, beckoning me to join, but I only nodded and kept my pace slow, refusing to be swept into the current. The interior of Veritas was breathtaking. Every detail carried a sense of classic luxury, as though someone had considered every centimeter of space with meticulous intention. High ceilings, glass chandeliers cascading like crystal dew, casting warm, golden reflections across people's skin. Dark velvet walls paired with black oak and cold-toned abstract art. I felt as though I had stepped into a noir film I was not sure I had a role in. I passed the long bar where cocktails were crafted like ritual. Bartenders in crisp white shirts and black ties moved with the precision of performers. The guests were not the kind who came to get drunk. They came to be seen, to belong to a place where their presence suggested something about wealth, power, and secrets. I looked around but did not see him. My heart tightened. I had warned myself not to expect anything, but hope always found a way to slip through the smallest cracks. I wove through the crowd, trying to look composed while my insides churned. The red dress clung to me, making every step feel like a display I was not prepared for. When I passed a semi-private seating area draped with dark velvet curtains, I saw a man speaking into a phone, his voice low and steady, his face half hidden in shadow. I looked for only a second, but my heart slammed against my ribs. It was him. Nathaniel Russo. His black hair slicked back, charcoal suit tailored to impossible perfection. His wrist revealed a black leather-banded watch that probably cost more than my rent. He tilted his head as though listening carefully to something important, his eyelashes lowering, sharpening the edges of his cold expression. I turned away at once, breath uneven. I did not know what I wanted. A glance? A moment of acknowledgement? Or simply to stand near enough to remember his cologne. And then, just as I turned to find Lauren, a passing waiter bumped into me in the crowded walkway. It wasn't a hard shove, but enough to make me stumble against the sharp corner of a marble high-top table. The impact jarred my arm, and the clutch already strained from holding the thick notebook slipped from my sweating fingers. It hit the ground with a heavy thud. Because the class was under so much pressure, the lock didn't just open, it shattered. The clutch burst apart like a secret that refused to be kept. It slid across the glossy black floor, spinning wildly, spitting out its contents. Everything slowed. The red notebook tumbled out, skidding into the spotlight, its pages fluttering open and scattering across the ground like autumn leaves swept by wind. I dropped to my knees, heart pounding violently, scrambling to gather them. I heard the sound of firm, decisive footsteps approaching. A pair of polished black leather shoes stopped in front of me. When I looked up, his eyes were fixed on the notebook in his hands. The pages rustled as he turned them, his gaze moving line by line as though deciphering a code. I could not breathe. Only one thought echoed in my skull like a warning bell. He is reading, and when he lifted his head to look at me, his eyes were no longer cold. They were frozen, as if what he had just read had stopped time around him. And I, Clara Hastings, was no longer the invisible woman in a world I had only dared observe from afar. I had stepped into his world in the rawest, most foolish way imaginable. There was nowhere left to hide, no safe distance, only his gaze and the truth contained in the words I never meant for him to see. His gaze locked onto me like a cold blade driven straight into the marble floor between us. In his hand, the red notebook lay open. Its trembling, slanted handwriting exposed words I once believed only I would ever read. The room around me felt frozen, the music fading into a distant murmur until only the frantic thud of my heartbeat remained, pounding in my ears like a warning drum. I dropped to my knees, reaching for the notebook, but he shifted his weight subtly, stepping out of reach with a calmness so controlled it bordered on dispassionate. He said nothing, only studied me for a few moments longer, then turned and walked away. I froze, unsure whether to flee or follow, but he made the decision for me. He did not return the notebook. He ascended the stairs toward the second-floor VIP level and glanced once over his shoulder, a look that was not a question, but a command. He did not need to speak. I understood. If I wanted it back, I had to follow him. I climbed the steps behind him slowly, each carpeted riser clinging to my feet as if resisting the path ahead. My heartbeat was chaotic not from fear, but from the dizzying realization that I was about to face something I had imagined for 4 long years. A part of me still hoped he would not be that man, that he would laugh, ask lightly, like in a movie, "Why did you write about me like this?" But there was no softness in his eyes. He pushed open a heavy wooden door leading into a private room, the kind of space so refined it felt deliberately distant. A long meeting table, several black leather chairs, dark wood-paneled walls, and a soft amber glow falling from a small crystal chandelier suspended above. He stood at the head of the table, placed the notebook down, and tapped its leather cover with one finger. I stepped inside, and the door clicked shut behind me with a soft sound that still sent a shiver down my spine. There was no one else. Only him and me. Nathaniel Russo stared at me as if trying to determine whether I was a threat or some strange joke fate had delivered to his doorstep. He did not sit. "What is your name?" His voice was low, cold, clipped, more an interrogation than a question. "Clara," I whispered. "Clara Hastings." He nodded once, as if filing it away. "And this notebook belongs to you?" I nodded again. He flipped through a few pages, reading a passage I could not even remember writing, then lifted his gaze. "How long have you been watching me, Clara Hastings?" The air in my lungs thickened. There was no way to deny it. No way to disappear from this room. No more hiding behind cappuccino cups and italicized notes across the street from his nightclub. I drew a long, steadying breath. 4 years. He frowned, as though trying to solve an equation with no rational answer. "Why?" I looked at the notebook, then at him for the first time directly, not through glass or imagination. "You saved me. At the Midtown subway. A winter night. I was attacked. You came out of nowhere, knocked him down, and left before I could say anything." His face remained still, but I saw his lips tighten for a moment. "I couldn't forget you. But I couldn't get close either. I knew you weren't accessible. So I just watched. I wrote things down. It was the only way I knew to keep you real." He was silent for a long time. The room seemed to sink into his thoughts. Then he moved toward me slowly, each step pulling me deeper into something I did not understand. He stopped close enough that I could hear the uneven edge of my own breathing. "What are you?" he asked quietly. "An obsessed fan? A spy? Or just a lonely girl with too much imagination?" I did not know where the courage came from, but I held his gaze. "Maybe all of them." He studied me another moment, then lifted the notebook, closed it carefully, and extended it toward me. I reached out, but at the last second he drew it back. "No, I'm keeping it." "Why?" "Because I need to read more." "For what?" "To understand you. Or to decide what I need to do with you." My breath caught. He set the notebook on the table, turned, and opened the door. "Sit here, do not leave. I'll be back." Then he stepped outside, leaving me alone with a shockwave inside my chest and the overwhelming sense that, for the first time in my life, I had been stripped bare before the only person I had ever wanted to truly see me. I sat frozen in the quiet room, my hands clasped tightly on my lap, my fingers cold as if they had been dipped in ice. The room no longer held his footsteps or his presence, but the echo of his gaze lingered like smoke refusing to dissipate. I stared at the notebook lying neatly on the table, silent, yet screaming every word I had ever written. Thoughts meant only for me now lay exposed, a mirror reflecting the rawest parts of myself I never meant to reveal. The door opened again after nearly 10 minutes, and he returned with another man. This one wore a black shirt without a tie, his body solid, his eyes sharp as a blade. He leaned against the wall without speaking while Nate took the seat directly across from me. The distance between us was so slight I could smell the faint cedar and tobacco notes of his jacket, rich, dark, like the low hum of a cello at midnight. Nate did not look at me at first. He reopened the notebook, flipped to a page near the end, placed his finger on a line, and read aloud in a voice that never rose but sliced through my skin all the same. He checked his watch at 7:13, furrowed his brow for 3 seconds. He seemed displeased. The man beside him lowered his head. I cannot tell if that was submission or fear. He paused, lifting his eyes to meet mine. You wrote down even this? I swallowed hard and nodded. Why? His voice was not angry now, but edged. I lowered my gaze to my hands. Because it was the only way to understand you. I know nothing about you beyond what people say. But when I observe, I can see what they miss. I just wanted to know whether the man who saved me that night was real, or if he was something I imagined to survive. Silence again. Taut. Humming. The man by the wall shifted, but Nate raised a hand to stop him. He kept staring at me, but something in his eyes had changed. Not suspicion, something evaluative. What did you study? He asked. The question startled me. I have a master's in archival and information science. Where do you work? The New York Public Library. Rare Documents Division. He nodded, unsurprised, as though the piece fit neatly into a mental map he was drawing. And how long have you documented my routines? 3.5 years. He flipped through several more pages. No errors. Every detail recorded with a level of observation most people cannot sustain. I could not tell whether that was praise or a warning. He closed the notebook, placed both hands on the table, and intertwined his fingers. Do you understand that you violated my privacy? I nodded. I know. I have no excuse. I lifted my gaze, my voice trembling but steady. I just couldn't stop. A tight silence followed. Then he smiled. Not wide, not warm, barely a shift of his mouth, but I saw it. And the sight sent a jolt through me. Do you know what the strange part is, Clara? I shook my head. I think I should be angry. I think I should throw you out of this building. But instead, I want to ask you something else. He leaned back slightly, his eyes shadowed like the stillness before a storm. Would you like to work for me? I froze. Work. Doing what? Observing. Recording. But this time with intention. With directives. With pay. And with boundaries. I could not breathe. My entire inner world tilted. Part of me screamed no, but another part whispered something I had wanted for so long, to be near him, to see him openly, and for the first time, not as someone scribbling in the margins. Nate stood, leaving me with his unfinished question and a gaze both dangerous and full of possibilities, a doorway I had never dared to step through until now. I did not answer right away. His question hung in the air like a half-open door revealing a part of the world I had never been permitted to touch. Nate stood at the head of the table, his eyes never leaving me, watching my reaction as if I were the first test in a long line of them. Work for him. Observe for him. I, the woman who had silently followed him for nearly 4 years, was now being offered a hand into his world, a gesture that looked as much like an opportunity as it did a trap. I swallowed hard, my palms damp. Why me? I asked, trying to steady my voice. You already have a dozen people working for you. Professional, loyal, trained. I'm just ordinary. I don't understand the rules. I don't know your world, and I've never done anything like this. Nate moved around the table slowly, stopping close to where I sat. He did not sit, only stood there, towering above me, his shadow stretching long across the dark wood wall behind me. Precisely because you don't belong to this world, he said quietly. No, Nate, I interrupted, surprising even myself. It's not just instinct. For 6 years, I have examined manuscripts to detect forgeries. I look for the slightest inconsistency in ink, a microscopic pause in a signature, a page that has been rebound to hide a missing chapter. Liars are just like forged documents. They follow a pattern until they make one small, fatal error in their narrative. Your security team looks for weapons and threats. I look for the story that doesn't make sense. Nate narrowed his eyes, the corner of his mouth lifting. And you think you can find the forgeries in my organization? If you let me read them, I whispered, I can find anything. You see with instinct, with intuition. You don't try to interpret your record. You let events tell their own story. And that is worth more than anything I've ever paid others to give me. I glanced at the notebook he still held hostage. Inside were the words I had written with my heart, with my loneliness, with a longing I had never dared to name. I did not write to impress him. I wrote to exist. I'm not sure I can do what you're asking, I whispered. I don't know how far I can go. Nate narrowed his eyes slightly. I'm not asking you to be a spy. I need a pair of eyes I can trust. Someone behind the screen, documenting expressions, reactions, shifts in posture, how someone holds a glass, how they look away when asked a difficult question. Small things. But those small things, Clara, are where the truth hides. I pressed my lips together. And if I say no? Then I'll let you walk away, he said immediately, without hesitation. I will keep the notebook. I'm not promising I won't use it, but I won't destroy you with it. You're not a threat. At least not yet. I understood. He wasn't threatening me. He was simply reminding me of the imbalance of the difference between who he was and who I was. But more than that, he was offering something. A way to exist near him without shadows or glass between us. I stood up, my legs trembling slightly though I tried to mask it. I need time to think. Nate nodded once. 3 days. Not more. After that, I will assume your answer is no. I nodded, turned, and walked out quickly. No one stopped me. As I stepped back into the night, my mind felt tangled as thread. I wandered through the December streets, the cold cutting through my coat, though I barely felt it. I walked for blocks without knowing where I was going, only knowing that something inside me had opened. 3 days later, I returned to Veritas. No appointment. The doorman looked at me once and nodded, as though he had been instructed in advance. I was led to the same room. Nate stood by the window, looking out at the city. When I entered, he did not turn. You've decided? He asked. I drew a breath and nodded. I'll do it. But I have conditions. He turned then, the corner of his mouth lifting almost imperceptibly. I'm listening. I want to record everything. But I keep the originals. If you want to read them, I'll lend them. But they're mine. Nate studied me for a long moment. Then he nodded. Agreed. And just like that, I became part of his world. No more watching from afar. No more sitting in cafes across the street. I stepped inside, with wide-open eyes and a heart that had never learned to protect itself. But deep down, I knew that for the first time in many years, I had chosen to walk toward the very thing that frightened me most. And I did not look back. The surveillance room lay deep beneath Veritas, behind a metal door with no nameplate. Guarded only by a fingerprint lock and a 32-character code I had to memorize like an oath before entering. The lighting inside was dim, just enough to illuminate the rows of security monitors curved around the central control desk like a massive fan. Before me were 8 large screens, each split into 4 quadrants showing different corners of the club: the main hall, the bar, the second-floor corridor, the VIP room, the service hallway, the underground garage, the emergency exit, and the back meeting room where tonight's confidential gathering would take place. I sat in a black leather swivel chair, headphones on, fingers poised above the digital note-taking keyboard, my heartbeat measured and cautious as though each sound I captured could shift something fundamental. The meeting room door opened at 8:12. Nate entered first, charcoal suit, black tie, no smile, no idle glance around him. He took the central seat, tilting his head slightly the way he did when he was assessing a room he already knew intimately. 2 minutes later, 3 men entered, all dressed more casually than he was, but none hiding the tension in their shoulders or their eyes. I didn't know their names, and Nate had told me I didn't need to. Only observe, interpret, sense what wasn't spoken. The man on Nate's left middle-aged brown jacket, the habit of pressing his middle finger to his temple whenever something unsettled him. He did it 3 times in the first 10 minutes. The man across from Nate, early 30s, white shirt, top 2 buttons undone, tapping his fingers in a repeating 3-beat pattern on the table. He smiled often, but his eyes never did. The last man, gray hair, silent, not a word until the 17th minute, but each time he looked at Nate he tilted his head slightly, waiting for some unspoken signal. I typed continuously, missing nothing. Nate spoke little. He asked questions, never wasting words. Things like, "Who do you think was behind last week's incident?" Or, "If things go wrong, who would you leave behind?" I did not understand the full context, but I knew instantly this was not a normal meeting. It was a test, not just for the 3 men, but for me. I sensed it in the way Nate rested his hands on the table, slow, even, setting a rhythm the room unconsciously followed. When the man in the brown jacket glanced at the camera a second too long, Nate shifted his posture. He crossed one leg over the other and leaned forward the first time he had changed position all evening. I noted, posture shift moving from defense to evaluation. When the younger man mentioned a contact near the southern docks, Nate's eyes narrowed not in disbelief, but as if measuring the truth inside the detail. The gray-haired man stayed quiet until Nate asked, "If you had to remove one weak link, who would it be?" He answered immediately, "Whoever talks the most." Nate smiled just barely, so faint I rewound the footage to ensure I hadn't imagined it. The meeting ended at 8:52. The 3 men left one by one, none walking out together. Nate remained alone for 3 additional minutes. Then he stood, walked to the corner of the room, and looked up directly at a camera mounted near the ceiling. I straightened in my chair, my hand suspended over the keyboard. He stared into the lens as if he knew exactly who was behind it. No smile, no blink. Just a long, steady, depthless look that made me feel as though I was the one under surveillance. Then he turned and walked out as if nothing had happened. I removed my headphones slowly, sinking back into my chair. I didn't know whether he was testing me, but if it was a test, I knew one thing with absolute clarity: I had stepped one layer deeper into a place where there was no path back. The next morning, I placed my notes on Nate's desk exactly as instructed, neatly arranged, each section labeled, every timestamp carefully written, under a simple heading: Observation Report, Thursday evening meeting, 8 o'clock. No one had asked me to write that much, but every small detail, the flick of a finger, the length of a blink, the shift of emphasis in someone's voice had surfaced in my mind with clarity so vivid, it felt as though my brain had been wired to record what others overlooked. I did not know when he would read it, or if he would truly read it at all. But only a few hours later, while I was sitting alone in the corner of the surveillance room with only a computer screen and a cup of tea that had long gone cold because I had forgotten it existed, the internal phone rang. His voice came through the receiver, steady as always but a half-tone lower. "Clara, come to my office." I set down my headphones, my heartbeat quickening. I knew this wasn't a reminder or a reprimand. Something in the way he'd said my name made a quiet unease coil deep in my chest. Nate's office always carried a kind of intentional minimalism, as if the complexity inside him demanded a room stripped of anything unnecessary to counterbalance it. A walnut desk, a large window overlooking Franklin Street, two leather chairs facing one another, and curtains drawn halfway, as though he preferred a controlled kind of darkness. He was standing against the desk, my report in his hand. When I stepped inside, he didn't speak immediately. His gaze moved from the page to me and back again, as if he were trying to reconcile the two versions of me, the woman who wrote those lines and the woman standing before him. Finally, he set the notes down. "I read it 3 times," he said. His voice wasn't raised, but there was a deliberate slowness to it, as though he wanted each word to arrive intact in my ears. I stood still, unsure how to react. He came closer, stopping just an arm's length away. "You don't just see, Clara," he said. "You perceive. You read what exists behind the eyes, behind the gestures. People spend years learning how to do that, and you write as if it's instinct." I drew in a breath and didn't release it right away. "Sometimes I think I'm strange," I admitted softly. "I've always observed more than I've participated. I understand people more than I understand myself. And now, that has put me here, in front of you." Nate tilted his head slightly, and the sharpness in his eyes softened. He no longer looked at me as an outsider. Something was shifting. I saw it in the way he crossed his arms, an action he often used to guard himself, but this time it lacked its usual chill. It felt like attention, curiosity, interest. He asked questions not written in the report. "Who do you think is lying? Who do you trust least? If you were me, what would you do next?" Each question pulled me a step further into his world, and I answered without hesitation, without overthinking. I spoke from instinct, as though I had been in that room with him instead of behind a screen. When I stopped speaking, he didn't reply right away. He simply looked at me, his eyes steadier now, no longer reflective like a mirror but warm, like a door slightly ajar. Then he spoke, almost in a whisper. "You surprise me, Clara. No one has done that in a long time." I didn't know what that meant. A compliment, a warning, or an admission that he was taking a step toward me just as I had once stepped toward him through every written line. But I knew, from that moment, my presence was no longer something he merely tolerated. I had become a factor, a variable. Someone he was beginning to pay attention to, and that, dangerous as it was, made it impossible for me to retreat from the line we were now towing. The dinners began as harmless arrangements, when Nate would tell me to stay after my shift because "it's raining tonight," or "the kitchen made too much." But I understood no one keeps someone back 3 times in a week because of leftovers. The first dinner took place in a small dining room behind Veritas, its warm lighting reminiscent of a hidden Italian bistro tucked in a quiet corner of Soho. Nate sat across from me, holding a glass of wine he never drank from, his gaze no longer assessing but quietly watchful, as if waiting to see whether I would eat like a normal person or remain coiled in caution. I don't remember who asked the first question, but somehow we ended up talking about childhood food. I told him about my mother's chicken soup light, fragrant with ginger and scallions, something she made every time I was sick. Nate told me about the pasta his grandmother used to make on Sunday afternoons in Brooklyn, the whole family squeezing into a small kitchen with a crackling radio that played jazz and the rasping voice of an older cousin telling ridiculous stories. He spoke of childhood with no sentimentality, as though those memories were faded photographs tucked away somewhere, but I sensed something flicker behind his eyes, a thin paper cut of emotion he tried to ignore. I asked about the scar on his right arm, the long line from wrist to elbow, the sort that comes from a fight someone tried to hide but not well enough. Nate didn't answer immediately. He looked at me for a long moment before speaking, his voice low and even, as though recounting a stranger's life. He told me about the night he was 16 and intervened in a robbery at a corner store, blood staining his white shirt, and the first realization hitting him that he had stepped out of childhood for good. After that, he said simply, things changed. But I knew it wasn't simple. Just as my scars weren't on my skin, but in the way I always chose a seat near the exit, always tracked escape routes, always wrote down what others forgot. Another night, when rain tapped rhythmically against the glass roof behind Veritas, and the wine had loosened the distance between us, Nate asked me a question no one had ever asked, not sincerely. Do you believe someone can see one look in another person and know there's no turning back? I looked at him, surrounded by shadows and candlelight, and nodded. Yes, I think one look can alter someone's direction forever. He didn't respond, but I saw something shift in his expression, as if my answer touched a place inside him he rarely allowed anyone near. We fell into silence, not uncomfortable, not uncertain. Just two people existing in a rare kind of quiet the city could never offer. I don't remember who leaned in first. It could have been me. It could have been him. But when his lips touched mine, every memory of every man who had ever passed through my life dissolved like mist. Our first kiss wasn't hurried or dramatic. It was simply the natural continuation of everything left unsaid. His mouth was warm, his hand gentle at the base of my neck, as if afraid I might vanish if he held me tighter. I didn't tremble. I didn't fumble. I simply closed my eyes and let myself sink into the moment as though I had been waiting for it my entire life. And when he pulled away slowly, his eyes still on mine, I knew everything had changed. No more accidental dinners, no more idle curiosity. We had crossed a boundary as thin as breath, and on the other side lay something irreversible, something that might save us, or ruin us. But I was no longer afraid, because for the first time I did not feel like I was observing. I felt alive. I began to dream about him, not the sweet, soft, focused dreams of a romantic novel, but the kind that blurred dim lights, echoing footsteps, and that suffocating feeling of waking up with the ghost of cologne still clinging to my clothes. Our dinners became more frequent, without reason, without pretense, and neither of us mentioned what was happening between us, though we both knew. We didn't name it, as if giving it a name would make it shatter. But inside me, something was growing, swelling into two opposing halves, one part wanting to stay in his world forever, the other panicking, searching desperately for a way out. I began to fear my own emotions, fear the way I waited for his messages, fear the way I knew the exact rhythm of his footsteps when he approached the surveillance room, fear the way I lingered after my shift, foolishly hoping for a few extra minutes of hearing his voice, seeing his face. I told myself I was just working, just observing, a professional habit. But deep down, I knew I was no longer on the outside. I had stepped in heart first. I tried to create distance. I declined dinner once, using my health as an excuse. He only replied with a single word, "All right," and asked nothing more. I couldn't sleep that night. The next morning, when I walked into the surveillance room, there was a cup of hot tea on my desk, the kind I always drank, with a small note. Even without dinner, you still need to stay warm. I collapsed into my chair, all my attempts at retreat dissolving into nothing. I tried avoiding his gaze in the hallways, tried speaking shorter during briefings. But every time he looked at me a second too long, or brushed his hand lightly against my shoulder as he passed, it felt like the entire room erupted inside my chest. Once, he handed me a memo with the words, "I think you'll notice something I didn't." That simple sentence sent me into hours of analyzing not the document, but the meaning behind his tone. He trusted me. Or, he was testing me. He was giving me his confidence, or keeping me close to control me. I began doubting even my own thoughts. My feelings for him were real, painfully real. But what about what he offered in return? Was any of it real? Who was he when his walls weren't around him? I once believed I understood him better than anyone, but now, the closer I got, the more lost I felt. Every time he looked at me in silence as if reading straight into my mind, I felt like a child standing beneath a sky she couldn't understand, wondering why it had turned so dark. I wanted to step back. But where do you retreat when the very place that terrifies you is also the only place you feel alive? I was no longer the librarian sitting behind a desk smelling of old paper and turning pages. I was living in a rhythm that was dangerous, risky, and yet made my heart beat harder than it ever had. I found myself laughing more, but also crying quietly more. I remembered the look in his eyes when he said, "You surprise me," more vividly than anything anyone had ever said to me. I knew I could not go back to who I was, but I didn't know whether the road ahead would lead to any shore at all, or only into a labyrinth. And in that chaos, I realized I was no longer observing a man. I was observing myself for the first time with all my wounds, longing, and contradictions. And I wasn't sure I liked what I saw. But I also knew I could no longer turn back. Not anymore. Lauren sensed something was wrong the third time she saw me leaving Veritas past midnight with that quiet, unsettled look, as if I had just brushed against a place no one should ever enter. We used to be close enough to share ridiculous dreams and bitter heartbreaks back in our college dorm, but ever since I started working at the club, something between us had hollowed out. I told her nothing, and she learned to stay silent while watching. But Lauren had never been the type to ignore her intuition. She worked in public relations, practiced at reading people, analyzing expressions, connecting scattered pieces into a larger picture. A week later, she invited me out for coffee, pretending it was like old times, but something in her voice felt strained. We sat in our usual cafe in Brooklyn, but she stirred her coffee too long, her eyes never leaving my face. I tried to keep my voice steady, talked lightly about work at the library, but Lauren didn't smile, didn't ask follow-up questions. When I stood to leave, she touched my hand, a rare gesture, and whispered so softly it felt like it wasn't meant for me. "You're different, Clara. Not like before." I said nothing. I walked away without turning back. But I knew something had shifted from that moment on. And I was right. 2 days later, a man approached Lauren after work. He introduced himself as an agent with the Federal Drug Enforcement Administration. His name was Richard Gale. He didn't waste time. He showed her a blurry photograph from a security camera, a photo of me stepping out of the back door of Veritas, the yellow light catching my hair. Lauren froze when she saw my expression. It wasn't a smile she recognized, nor the quiet seriousness she knew. It was a face carrying something she couldn't name. Gale told her they were investigating Nate Russo, a man with a history tied to many shadowy dealings but never enough evidence to prosecute. And now, they needed a way in. "Your friend is an interesting thread," he said, eyes unblinking. "And we believe she has no idea what she's involved in." Lauren refused at first, insisting she knew nothing and wanted no part of it. But that night she stayed awake, replaying all the moments I vanished without explanation, all the clipped messages, the times she caught me staring off as if I were somewhere else entirely. She began searching. She found everything she could about Nate Russo, old articles, rumors, even personal blogs. His name appeared alongside disappearances, strange transactions, whispers across the city's undercurrent, always just far enough from the law to remain untouchable. And Clara Hastings, her closest friend, was now somewhere inside that orbit. Lauren couldn't sit still. She met Agent Gale again, this time bringing photos of me with Nate, fragments of messages she had glimpsed on my phone, the memory of one dinner where I left the table too long and returned pale as paper. Gale didn't say much. He simply collected the files, nodded, and promised they would handle things carefully. But Lauren knew the moment she handed over the information, there was no way to undo it. She stared out the cafe window at Manhattan glowing in the night and wondered if she had just betrayed the only friend she had ever truly trusted. But she also told herself that if I was sinking into something dangerous, this was the only way to pull me out. She didn't know that in doing so, she had already cracked the first fault line, one that would fracture not only our friendship, but the fragile world I was desperately trying to hold together. I knew something was wrong the moment I stepped into Nate's office and felt the air inside tighten as if every shard of light had been squeezed out between the four walls. He didn't lift his head when I approached, only turned the pages in front of him with a patience so deliberate it felt artificial. I stood there for a moment before softly saying his name. Nate finally looked up, and his eyes were colder than the first night we met in the club's private room, when he opened the fallen wallet and found my journal. He didn't gesture for me to sit or offer a glass of water like he usually did. He simply placed a photograph on the desk and slid it toward me. I looked down. It was me, sitting with Lauren in a cafe, leaning toward her, my expression tight, my hands clasped as though defending myself. I didn't remember the moment exactly, but I knew when it happened. Nate watched me for a long time before asking in a low, measured voice, "What did you tell her?" I looked at him, my throat dry. "Nothing about you, just personal things." She was worried, and I tried to reassure her. Nate crossed his arms, his eyes never leaving mine. "Then why is this image in a file the Drug Enforcement Administration sent to an attorney in Queens 3 days ago?" Each word cut like a slow blade, bloodless but impossibly painful. "I don't know." I didn't know they were watching me. I didn't know Lauren was involved. I thought it was just a normal meeting with a friend. Nate stood walking toward me. He wasn't angry, didn't raise his voice, but his eyes were sharp as a freshly honed knife. "It seems you think you're clever enough to play both sides, or you're a pawn someone else has pushed into place. Either way, I need answers." I trembled not from fear of him, but from the disappointment in his tone, the coldness in his gaze, a coldness I had never seen, not even in the most dangerous moments. He took out his phone, placed it on the desk between us. "Call Lauren. Right now. Tell her you're alone and want to talk honestly." I hesitated, but my hand was already reaching for the phone. I dialed. When Lauren answered, her voice warm but threaded with caution, I whispered, "Lauren, listen to me. Why do they have our photo?" On the other end, Lauren broke into a sob, her voice terrified. "Clara, I didn't go to them. I swear. I was just worried about you, so I started searching for his name online. I didn't know they were tracking digital footprints. Agent Gale approached me 3 days ago. He showed me logs of everything I searched. He said I was interfering with a federal investigation. He threatened to arrest me for conspiracy if I didn't give him something. Clara, they cornered me. I had no choice." Nate snatched the phone from my hand and switched to speaker. His voice was even, razor sharp. So they used you as bait to get to her. He ended the call, tossed the phone onto the desk, and turned away. I stood there, hollowed out, as if something had been torn straight through my chest. Nate didn't look back. His voice was quiet but freezing. I don't know how much you're telling the truth. But from this point on, there is no gray area. You stand with me, or you are no longer here. I wanted to scream that I wasn't betraying him, that I didn't know, that I was just a woman caught between an old friendship and a feeling I hadn't yet learned how to name. But I said nothing, because I knew that to him, in that moment, silence might be the clearest answer of all. And I began to understand that choosing was no longer theoretical. It had become survival. I returned to my apartment close to 3 a.m, after facing Nate and Lauren, after those cutting looks, after my inner world had been ripped in two. The room was dark and silent, so quiet I could hear the faint hum of the heater beneath the floor. I didn't turn on the lights. I sat down on the floor with my back against the familiar wall and stared into nothing. His words replayed in my head like a broken record. You stand with me, or you are no longer here. No gray area. I thought of Lauren, who held my hand through 3 years of college, who knew I loved old books, and always folded the page corner at the upper right. I thought of Nate, the man I once believed an unreachable mystery. But now, through every look, every calculated silence, every fractured confession from his past, I was beginning to see a man who still felt pain, who still believed, but never allowed himself to be weak. And I realized that if I walked away now, I would lose them both. But what frightened me more was losing myself, the part of me that had begun to change, to wake up, to feel something deeper than fear. The next morning, I returned to Veritas. No one greeted me, no one looked at me, but somehow everyone seemed to know I had been summoned. Nate's office door was slightly open. He sat behind his desk, early light cutting across his face in a pale gold line. I stepped inside and stood still. He said nothing. I took one step toward him, then another. His eyes were icy, but I had learned the storm behind them. I lifted my chin and met his gaze. I choose you. My voice didn't shake. It wasn't weak. It was simply truth. I choose you, Nate. Not because I'm forced, not because I have nowhere else to go, but because I don't want to run anymore. I know I don't understand everything, but I believe that if there is any place I am allowed to exist fully, it is here. And if that means working for you, then I will. He didn't answer right away. He stood, moved around the desk, and faced me in silence, as if searching for the last crack in my resolve, the final proof that I was worth trusting. Then slowly, he nodded. Fine. From now on, you don't just observe. You will record, analyze, evaluate, and advise. Everything you hear, see, or sense matters. But if you hide anything, even a glance out of place, I will know. And I will not forgive a second time. I nodded. I didn't need gentleness. I needed truth. And he, in all his chaos, was the only person who had never lied to me. Nate walked to the desk, retrieved a small metal box, and opened it. Inside was an encoded access card and an unmarked phone. This is everything you need to begin. The password is set. Only you and I know it. You'll work alone. No one can know. You will report directly to me. He looked at me again, and his gaze no longer held control. It felt almost like he was handing me a piece of power he had never given anyone. I accepted the box with both hands. It was heavier than I expected, as if it carried the weight of a decision I could never take back. When I left his office, walking down the hallway toward the surveillance wing, the steel doors closing behind me no longer felt like barriers, but reminders that I had stepped into a place where every loyalty had its price. And I had paid with my own heart. The phone vibrated at 2:37 in the morning, the screen showing no number, only a single line: go into covert mode. I sat up instantly, not surprised, with no space for sleep or questions. It was the phone Nate had given me the night before. The cold metallic gray device with no caller name, no call history, only one channel of communication. I put on my coat, grabbed my notebook and headset, and stepped out of my apartment with a heart that no longer raced. Fear, in some strange way, had transformed into absolute clarity. I entered the surveillance wing through the back entrance, walking through the dim hallway where the lights were just bright enough to show my footsteps, and unlocked the control room with the code only Nate and I knew. On the table was a sealed envelope with a single handwritten line on the front: Observation file number 14. I opened it. Inside was a photograph of a man in his 50s, weathered, with neatly combed graying hair and a classic-style watch on his wrist. No name, no address. Only his movements over the past 3 days. One visit to an art gallery in Midtown, 2 entries into Veritas at 8 in the evening, and one instance of him walking in, but never walking out. Nate had once told me that being an observer wasn't just about watching, it was learning to interpret the meaning behind coincidence. He said nothing was ever random, every stray detail could be a signal. And now I was beginning to see those signals glow like invisible ink under ultraviolet light. I rewound the camera in the western hallway to the moment the man entered for the last time. He walked beside a woman in a long beige coat, her hair loose in soft curls, her steps quick. Her gaze avoided the camera, but her left hand tugged once at her sleeve, too precise to be accidental. 3 hours later, only the woman walked out. I zoomed in on her face, trying to read her expression, but she turned at the last second, revealing a faint, almost satisfied smile. I wrote, "No signs of concern?" Repeated wrist gesture, possible transmission or coded signal. I checked the camera in the basement meeting room next. The image was grainy, but clear enough for me to see the outline of the man sitting across from Nate. There was no audio, but his movements painted the scene. He kept placing his hand on his forehead, then dragging it down to his collar, a gesture steeped in anxiety or frustration. Nate remained composed, hands resting on the table, speaking only when necessary. I captured each frame, marking my notebook with every detail, sketching the angles of their bodies and the direction of their eyes. Patterns began forming. The curly-haired woman appeared more frequently during irregular hours, always entering through the service corridor. The graying man never used the main entrance, and every time he appeared, Nate's posture changed from relaxed to leaning forward, a shift that only occurred when he needed control more than usual. I wrote, "Possible internal informant, or someone who has already crossed a line." I didn't dare conclude anything. My job wasn't to decide guilt or innocence, it was to gather enough truth for someone else to decide. But the more I observed, the more I realized I was being drawn closer to the center where no one existed as just a shadow. I saw how these meetings were choreographed like a complicated score, each person stepping in on cue, every subtle gesture carrying its own meaning. I saw Nate in this landscape not as the cold figure others believed him to be, but as someone who tailored every reaction, a conductor standing in the eye of chaos and turning it into order. By the time I shut down the monitors and wrote my final note, dawn was breaking. Early sunlight slipped through the doorframe, casting a thin beam across the page where I wrote my last line. Every action is a form of speech. My work is to learn how to listen. And I knew then that I had stepped one layer deeper into his world, a world where every sentence had 2 meanings and every look carried the weight of a warning. But instead of fear, all I felt was a steadiness, as if everything I had ever observed in other people's lives had been preparation for this moment. Here, exactly where I was meant to be. That night, Veritas closed earlier than usual, without the drifting jazz that normally slipped down from the ceiling. Without the gleam of crystal glasses or the warm sheen of polished walnut tables. It was just Nate and me in the upstairs surveillance room, where one wall was covered in monitors and the other opened into a glass window overlooking Franklin Street sinking slowly into fog. I had just finished my observation report when he walked in, saying nothing as he set 2 glasses of whiskey on the table. I looked up, ready to ask a question, but he gave a slight shake of his head, a quiet invitation to follow him. We walked down a narrow hallway into the small room behind the rooftop terrace, a place I had never been allowed to enter before. It smelled of old leather and aged wood, laced with the faint trace of a long-dead cigarette and the soft glow of a brass-toned desk lamp. Nate sat in the armchair by the window, glass in hand, eyes fixed on a distant point as though reading a line of memory suspended in the air. He didn't begin with a story, but with a question. Do you believe a person can be reborn many times in a single lifetime? I was startled, but nodded. Do you think people change because of love or because of pain? The question hung in the air like a test with no correct answer. I looked at him and spoke slowly. I think pain teaches people how to survive, and love teaches them why they want to live at all. Nate smiled, truly smiled for the first time in weeks. It wasn't the smirk or guarded grin I had grown used to, but a weary, almost relieved expression, as if he had been waiting a very long time for someone to say exactly that. He began speaking, not looking at me, his gaze still fixed outside the glass. He told me about a winter morning in Brooklyn when he was 14, standing at the doorway with torn shoes, finally understanding his father would never come back. About his mother, a woman so silent he once believed she had no voice at all. About the days spent wandering train stations just to stay out of the cold of an apartment that smelled of liquor and resignation. He spoke of the first time he felt power, when he beat up a kid who had stolen an old woman's purse and the neighborhood patted his shoulder as though he had become a hero. Of the first time someone called him Russo instead of his given name, as if who he was had been absorbed into something larger, darker, something he could neither refuse nor fully escape. I sat quietly, fingers tightening around my glass, watching every subtle shift in his eyes. There was no dramatic tragedy, no sobs, no tears. Just fragments of a life laid out like stones he had stepped on, one by one, to reach the man he was now. He turned to me, his voice low and rough. You have no idea how many parts of myself I've had to lose, just to hold on to the one part I can still control. There are nights I can't remember my own name, only the look in the eyes of someone I left behind. And there are days I wish I weren't so good at surviving. I don't know when I moved closer to him. All I knew was that when he lifted his head, the distance between us was no longer a room, it was a breath. I didn't ask anything more, didn't offer empty comfort. I simply reached out and rested my hand on his. He looked down, then looked up again, and for once, his eyes were not a barricade. We kissed not like 2 people pulled together by desire, but like 2 survivors in a burning world who had finally found a moment of quiet in the ashes. Everything softened, time slowing to the rhythm of our breathing and the wind rising from the street below. In that moment, there were no blood debts, no dossiers, no DEA agents or looming threats. Only the 2 of us, Clara and Nate, 2 scarred pieces finally allowing themselves to be soft, to be honest, to be close as if the past had never existed. The call came late Wednesday afternoon as I was reviewing the latest behavioral analysis in the surveillance room. The screen showed an unknown number, and I was about to decline it when I noticed the area code belonged to the district where Lauren worked. I answered, and her voice flooded the line, not the confident tone I knew by heart, but something strangled, trembling, on the edge of panic. Clara, I need to see you. Right now. Don't ask me anything on the phone. Please. My heart slammed against my ribs. Something had spiraled out of control. I asked to leave my shift early and went to the meeting place she sent, a small cafe in Long Island City, the place we always chose when conversations mattered. Lauren was already there, face bare of makeup, eyes red, shoulders pulled inward beneath a coat far too big for her. When I sat down, she didn't wait for me to ask anything. She pulled a thick envelope from her bag and shoved it into my hands. I opened it. Inside were copies of a summons, a bail notice, and an audio file extracted from a federal surveillance device. The voice in the recording was mine from a meeting 3 nights earlier, when I had reported suspicious movements of one of Veritas's top clientele. A coldness spread from the back of my neck to my palms. They aren't just asking for help, Clara. They're blackmailing me. Lauren's hands shook as she pushed the envelope across the table. Gail said that if I don't convince you to turn on Russo, they will prosecute me for accessing classified information data I didn't even know I was looking at. 10 years, Clara. My career, my life. It's all over unless you help them. She looked at me, eyes wide with desperation. They don't care about justice. They just want to win. And they are using my life as leverage to force your hand. They've pushed me right to the edge. I looked at her, and there was no anger left in me, only a grief so deep it felt hollow. Lauren, you didn't trust me enough to wait for me to explain. You went to the government before you asked me once what was actually happening. You let them use you as a pawn, and now I'm just another name on a file they need to exploit. Lauren grabbed my hand, squeezing hard. You can still get out, Clara. You're not as involved as they think. You can still walk away. Do the right thing. Her voice cracked. Please, do the right thing before it's too late. I pulled my hand back, not out of rejection, but because touching her would have made everything hurt more. I left the cafe with my thoughts in chaos. Inside me, the words, the right thing, echoed and echoed. But how was I supposed to define right when everything I felt pointed in the opposite direction of every rule I'd ever learned? I once believed the DEA represented justice, the shield protecting society. But now, they were the ones threatening, manipulating, twisting the closest bonds of my life. I once believed Nate was the darkness. But in this shifting world, he was the only one who didn't lie about who he was, didn't dress his intentions in pretty words, didn't push me to choose. He let me decide. And now I was being forced to choose between the woman I had once called a sister and the man I was falling in love with, though I had never dared name it aloud. That night, I didn't go home. I stayed in the surveillance room until dawn, replaying each recording, listening to the sound of my own voice in those reports, rereading every line I had written in my notebook. I was living 2 separate lives, but their borders had dissolved. And just as everything seemed to be collapsing, one truth rose above the wreckage. Neutrality was no longer an option. If I didn't choose a side, I would be crushed between them. And I began to understand that the decision ahead of me would not be made by logic alone, but by loyalty, memory, and the fresh scar born from that first kiss in the room that smelled of old wood. The call came at 8 o'clock in the morning, from an unknown number with no name attached, but this time I already knew who it would be. I stood in the middle of my apartment, fingers tightening around the phone as the familiar voice emerged on the other end, calm and carrying that invisible kind of authority that made refusal feel almost impossible. It was Agent Richard Gale. His voice was devoid of humanity, purely transactional. We have your friend, Ms. Hastings. Lauren is currently in a holding cell. Whether she walks out or goes to federal prison depends entirely on what you do in the next hour. A cold clarity washed over me. You are supposed to be the good guys, I whispered. There are no good guys, Clara. Only winners. Gail paused. Bring us the files on Russo and Lauren goes free, or stay loyal to a criminal and watch your friend's life burn. I hung up without answering. In that silence, I realized the difference between the two men. Nate had given me a choice. Gail had given me an ultimatum. And in that moment, I knew exactly where I stood. An hour later, I was in Nate's office, morning light pouring through the window in slabs of amber and gold, making the room look as though it were breathing. He stood with his back to me, lighting a cigarette I had never seen him touch since the day we met. I didn't know what he had already heard through his network, but when I spoke, he turned just enough for me to see his eyes not cold, but quietly waiting. I'm not going. I won't meet them. I'm not a spy. I'm not a piece of evidence. I am someone who is chosen. I choose to stay. I choose you. I didn't need Nate to smile or pull me into his arms. I only needed the slight nod he gave, the kind he had offered in my earliest days here, when he accepted my silences without demanding trust. From that moment on, I was no longer someone standing outside, looking into his world. I was part of it. And everything changed faster than I imagined. I was placed on the internal security list, given a private access code, a second communication device, and a foreign bank account whose origins I was not allowed to question. Each morning, instead of emails, I received meeting schedules through a folder placed on my desk by someone I never met and never once saw. I no longer observed behavior alone. I was tasked with analyzing vulnerabilities, mapping relational structures, predicting actions according to time and circumstance. Nate no longer reviewed my notes each night. He passed them directly to the core team, where decisions were executed without discussion. I didn't ask questions, nor did I attempt to understand the entire web, but I knew I had crossed a line that no ordinary person could ever return from. One night, after an emergency meeting in the sealed basement where there was no cell signal and the lighting was barely enough to read, Nate pulled me into the hallway, where the smell of damp concrete and rusted iron felt peeled out of another era. He looked at me for a long time before speaking in a voice I had never heard from him before. If the day ever comes when everything collapses, don't come looking for me. Don't ask. Don't come back. Treat it as a long dream and nothing more. I didn't answer. I only looked at him and saw in his eyes not warning, but a depth of sorrow, as if he had once lost someone because of this same instruction and never forgave himself for it. I touched his cheek cold and coarse, like the surface of the world I was stepping into, and whispered that if such a day ever came, I would never call it a dream, because I have never felt more awake than I do here, with you. Nate said nothing more, but the way he held my hand that night tighter and longer than ever before was its own confession, that I had not fallen into this accidentally. I had chosen to dissolve into it, no longer observing, no longer hovering at the edge. I was part of the vortex, and I had stopped running. I don't know the precise moment I changed. Perhaps it was when I received that first nameless call, or when I laid my hand against Nate's cheek and felt my heart stop fleeing, but by the time he handed me a thin dossier containing only 3 lines of description, I was no longer the Clara who once hid in the library searching for safety between old pages. The file contained the name of one of the 4 members of the internal executive team, the people Nate trusted completely. There was no concrete evidence, only a string of anomalies so small that no one would have noticed them unless they had documented everything for 4 months straight. Nate told me he needed me not as a tool, but as someone who saw the things others overlooked. And I began. I treated the surveillance room not like a security hub, but like an archive. I didn't just watch. I cataloged. I built a timeline of every employee's movement for the last 6 months. I cross-referenced shifts with phone logs, creating a massive visual map on the wall that looked less like a spy's board and more like a genealogy of chaos. My eyes burned, my head ached, but I didn't stop. It wasn't magic. It was the brutal, tedious work of finding a needle in a haystack. I began to see the gaps. Gabriel Knox was perfect. Too perfect. His routine was a rehearsed script, unlike the natural randomness of the others. But in my world, the world of historical archives, perfection is often the sign of a forgery. I noticed a pattern no one else saw. Every Tuesday at 8:04 p.m., right before the shift change, Gabriel checked his watch for 3 seconds longer than necessary. It wasn't a nervous tick. It was a synchronization. He was signaling a window of silence. I didn't sleep for 3 nights. I mapped his perfect moments against external data, creating a timeline that revealed the invisible ink beneath the surface. When I handed Nate the completed analysis, he said nothing for nearly 10 minutes. Then he lifted his head, looking at me not as a lover, but as a weapon he hadn't realized he possessed. The plan was built in 4 hours. I didn't need a gun to trap Gabriel. I used information. I deliberately leaked a fabricated schedule that shifted the transfer time by exactly 4 minutes, just enough to break his synchronization. I inserted a flaw in the data, a breadcrumb that only a traitor looking for a way in would notice, and he took the bait. Gabriel walked into the trap 37 hours later, arriving at the warehouse 3 hours before anyone else had been informed. Nate and the team were waiting in the dark. No gunshots, no shouting. Just a single look between him and me, the moment he realized that I was the one who had exposed him. In that look, I was no longer the girl sitting quietly in the surveillance corner. I was the person who pulled the final thread. After it ended, after Gabriel was taken away, after the internal file was sealed with my identification code as part of the upper tier, I stood alone in the control room, watching my faint reflection on the dark monitor. I did not see a fragile woman. I did not see a pawn who stumbled into a dangerous board. I saw someone who had chosen, fought, and won. Nate walked in, light from the hallway stretching his shadow across the floor, his voice low and steady. "You're not an observer anymore, Clara. You just became something no one ever imagined you could be." I turned to him, and for the first time I felt myself standing level with him, not someone guided, but someone who now walked beside. No, Nate. I was never just observing. I was waiting for the right moment to act. And in that moment, I knew I had become stronger than the version of myself from a month ago, a year ago, any of the years I had spent hiding inside my own shell. I no longer looked at the world through the lens of an outsider. I was part of it now, sharp, relentless, and braver than I ever believed I could be. And I was no longer afraid. I folded the last dossier just before dawn, when Veritas had settled into the kind of silence that feels absolute. On the desk lay my familiar ink pen, the worn corner of my journal, and beyond the glass window the city stood quiet without ever truly sleeping. Lights still glowed in distant towers, and somewhere beneath those calm surfaces, movement continued in places no one could see. I once believed I would live like that forever, quietly, observing, recording, nothing more than a shadow drifting at the edges of other people's stories. But then I met Nate, not as a character entering my life, but as a door opening into a world where every rule was rewritten. It was a world that was neither easy nor safe, but it was real. I had to choose, had to confront, had to betray old certainties and rebuild myself from what remained. And now, looking back, I no longer see the girl who hid behind a notebook and avoided the weight of her own reflection. I see someone who stepped through fear, who loved with her whole heart, and who fought to protect what she believed in. Under the final soft glow of the night, I wrote the last line in the journal I had begun months ago. I have stopped observing. Now I am living. It was not merely the end of an entry, but the beginning of an entirely different journey. A journey no one else could define for me, with no script to follow, only my choices day after day. The story of Clara Hastings may be fiction, but what makes it worth telling isn't the secrets, or the chases, or the danger of the underground world. What matters is the awakening of a soul that had once been afraid, had once hidden itself, had once believed life was meant to be watched, rather than lived. Through everything that happened, the question I offer you, the one listening, is this: are you truly living your life? Or are you merely watching it pass by, like a spectator? Have you ever loved someone without daring to admit it? Ever wanted something but lacked the courage to reach for it? Ever wished you could be just a little stronger? If the answer is yes, then you are not alone, and it is never too late to begin. If this story touched something quiet and vulnerable inside you, please share your thoughts below. We would truly love to hear what you felt, the deepest reflections you carried, the personal connections that might help someone out there realize they are not alone either. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to the channel so you won't miss the heartfelt, meaningful, deeply human stories we bring to life each day. Stories not just to hear, but to feel, to reflect on, and to awaken something within you. Thank you for staying with us until the very end of this journey. I wish you good health, a joyful life, and peaceful, gentle days ahead. See you in the next video. Goodbye, and may your day be wonderful.